There is a specific kind of silence that only exists at the edge of a breakdown. It isn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping city, but a heavy, suffocating pressure, the sound of a mind finally snapping under the weight of a world it was never meant to carry. They found him in a London hotel room long after the rest of the world had gone to sleep. Outside, the city was a blur of neon and cold rain, but inside that room, time had stopped. Houston Summers, the man who had just spent the last year being worshipped by millions, was slumped in a corner on the floor. His hands weren't just shaking. They were vibrating with a primal rhythmic terror. His breath came in jagged shards cutting through the stagnant air. When the light from the hallway finally cut through the gloom, he didn't shield his eyes. He didn't look for a friend. He didn't even seem to see the people standing there. He only looked into the empty air and whispered a sentence that turned the blood of everyone in that room to ice. It is here. For me. Think about that for a second. Only months before this night, Houston was a god in the eyes of the public. His voice, smooth, soulful, and seemingly effortless, had carried him from the humble hallways of Los Angeles to the top of the global charts. He was the golden child of a new era. When he walked onto a stage, the roar of the crowd was so loud it felt like it could move mountains. To us, he had everything. To us, he was the lucky one who had escaped the ordinary to touch the divine. But in that silent room, the curtains were pulled shut, as if to keep out a reality he could no longer handle. The gold records on the wall of his mind had turned to lead. What filled the space instead was a dread so thick you could almost touch it. We are fed a lie from the moment we are born that success is a shield. We are told that if you climb high enough, if you are loved enough, if your name is written in enough lights, you will finally be safe from the shadows. But Houston was the living, breathing proof of the opposite. He learned that the higher the pedestal, the more fragile the glass beneath your feet. He discovered that the spotlight doesn't burn away the darkness. It only makes the shadows gather closer, waiting for the moment the bulb finally flickers. This was not a common breakdown. This was a spiritual eclipse. On that night in London, Houston felt those shadows reaching into his chest, pulling at his faith, unraveling his sanity, and erasing the boy he used to be, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell of fear. He wasn't the star of the show anymore. He was a prisoner of his own glory. His real story doesn't begin in the recording booth or on the red carpet. It begins right here in the terrifying quiet moment when he realized he was no longer the one chasing a dream. The dream had caught him, and it was starting to eat him alive. He wasn't running toward the light anymore. He was running for his very soul from a darkness that no amount of fame could ever illuminate. Before the headlines began to scream his name, before the tour buses rolled through foreign cities, and the crowds became a blurred sea of faces, Houston Summers was just a quiet, observant boy growing up in the heart of California. Born in 1983, he entered a world where the music industry was exploding with neon sounds and synthetic beats. But for young Houston, the world felt much smaller and much more intimate. He was a child who understood the world through rhythm before he understood it through words. He felt it in his chest during long, solitary walks through his neighborhood, listening to the echoes of life, the distant sirens, the chatter from open windows, the wind humming through the power lines. For him, music wasn't just entertainment. It wasn't something you simply turned on to pass the time. It was a structure. It was a scaffolding for his soul, a way to hold himself steady in a world that often felt unpredictable and overwhelming. When his family moved to the sprawling, restless heart of Los Angeles, the frequency of his life changed. LA had a different pulse, faster, louder, and infinitely more demanding. Houston felt himself pulled toward that energy, like a tide he could not resist, even if it scared him. He eventually found himself at Alexander Hamilton High School, a place that breathed art, a sanctuary for those who saw the world through a different lens. In those hallways, Houston found his first real audience, but he didn't try to fit the mold of what was popular at the time. He didn't mimic the aggressive bravado of the rappers in the courtyard. Instead, he sang. He sang whatever rose in his mind, raw, unpolished, and devastatingly honest. He turned the linoleum hallways into makeshift cathedrals and the crowded classrooms into quiet theaters. There was a magnetic quality to his voice that felt out of place for a teenager. Teachers would stop mid-sentence to listen. Classmates would put down their notebooks, the usual chaos of high school falling into a sudden, respectful silence. People who had never even spoken to him began to linger near him, waiting, asking with a mix of curiosity and hope, "When are you going to sing again?" There is a pivotal moment in every artist's life when someone else sees a light in them that they aren't yet brave enough to recognize in themselves. For Houston, that moment didn't come from a record executive. It came from the school staff who watched him daily. They saw that he wasn't just lucky or talented. They used a different word. Different. The kind of different that doesn't fade when the bell rings. The kind of different that carries a heavy price. They pushed him to enter talent shows, and Houston, despite the shyness that clung to him like a second skin, won them all. But the trophies meant very little to him. What mattered was the growing, terrifying realization that the world he had imagined during those long childhood walks, a world where his voice could actually reach people, was finally within his grasp. Soon, the managers arrived. They were drawn by the way his voice carried not as a practiced performance, but as a bleeding confession. They recorded one of his school shows on a simple, shaky videotape. No editing, no lighting. Just a boy and his gift. They sent that tape to Capitol Records, hoping someone on the other end would pause long enough to notice the soul behind the song. Capitol did more than pause. They saw a star. For a young man who had not yet learned the crushing weight of his own gift, the resulting contract felt like a golden doorway. Houston entered the industry with a heart full of hope and a profound faith that his talent alone would protect him from the vultures. He believed the industry would let him remain the boy who sang in the hallways. He believed he could walk toward the light without ever losing his shadow. But as he signed that paper, the silence of his childhood was about to be replaced by a noise so loud it would eventually shatter him. When Houston Summers walked through the towering glass doors of Capitol Records for the first time, he felt like he was stepping into a cathedral built of dreams. The air felt different there, charged with the electricity of power and the scent of expensive ambition. For a moment, standing in the lobby, he was still the boy from the high school hallways, carrying nothing but a quiet hope and a voice that felt like his only true possession. He believed he was there to create. He believed his voice was enough. But the music industry is not a sanctuary. It is a factory, and the factory does not ask who you are. It tells you who you need to be. The shaping of Houston began almost immediately. Before a single note was recorded for his album, a small army was mobilized to dismantle the boy and rebuild the star. They brought in stylists to curate a wardrobe that reflected the trends of 2004, not the identity of the man wearing them. They brought in choreographers to teach him how to move, image consultants to teach him how to speak, and producers who handed him songs written by strangers in rooms he had never entered. Houston pushed back at first, a quiet resistance flickering in his eyes. But he was told this was the price of admission. He was told that every legend had to compromise a piece of themselves to reach the masses. So he nodded. He wore the clothes. He learned the steps. He showed up to every meeting, every rehearsal, and every fitting, even as a small, vital part of him began to dim. The boy who once sang because he had to was now singing because he was told to. Then the world heard the sound. In the summer of 2004, I Like That was unleashed. It was a track designed for maximum impact, featuring the heavy hitters of the era Chingy Nate Dogg and Ludacris. From the very first beat, it was undeniable. It had a kinetic, infectious energy that moved across the globe like a fever. It wasn't just a song, it was an anthem. It shattered the charts, climbing to the top 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 and infiltrating the airwaves from London to New Zealand. Suddenly, Houston wasn't just a name on a high school program. He was a global phenomenon. McDonald's picked up the track for a massive commercial campaign, and his face was everywhere. On television screens, in living rooms he would never visit, on billboards in cities he couldn't yet pronounce. His debut album, It Is Already Written, was released in August of that year and quickly went gold. The industry's gamble had paid off. The factory had produced a masterpiece. But as the gold plaques began to line the walls, the weight began to settle on Houston's shoulders. The success brought with it a relentless, crushing schedule. Long-haul flights across oceans, unfamiliar hotel rooms that all began to look the same, and a sea of screaming fans who loved the image but didn't know the man. Those closest to him began to notice the subtle, terrifying shifts. While the public saw a confident rising star, his team saw a young man who was slowly drifting away. He would go silent for hours, lost in a private labyrinth of thought. He would hesitate when the cameras turned off, as if he were trying to remember which version of himself he was supposed to be in that moment. The industry had given him the world, but it had taken his silence. It had given him fame, but it had taken his peace. He was shining brighter than he had ever imagined possible, but he was burning out from the inside. The shadow that had started as a small flicker during his childhood walks had now grown into a towering presence, following him into every spotlight, waiting for the moment when the music would finally stop, and the silence would become too loud to bear. The turning point did not come with a frantic warning or a sudden flash of lightning. It arrived quietly, like a cold fog rolling in over a clear sky, obscuring everything in its path. By the early months of 2005, Houston Summers was no longer the boy who walked the streets of Los Angeles with music in his chest. He was a man hollowed out by a schedule that demanded everything and gave back nothing but exhaustion. London was supposed to be just another stop on the international tour, another city, another stage, another hotel. But from the second he touched down on British soil, Houston felt the air change. It became heavy thick with a dread he couldn't name. His thoughts, once his only refuge, had turned into sharp, jagged edges that he could no longer control. The pressure he had spent months burying under stylists' clothes and choreographed smiles finally began to erupt through the cracks. Those traveling with him saw the shift first, and it terrified them. The vibrant, humble young man they knew had vanished, replaced by a ghost who spoke in cryptic, fragmented sentences. He began to pray with a desperation that bordered on agony, clutching his faith like a man clinging to a piece of driftwood in the middle of a hurricane. But for Houston, even prayer felt like it was being intercepted. He believed with a chilling and absolute certainty that he was no longer alone in his mind. The night everything collapsed felt like any other night on the road. A performance, a sea of flashing lights, the ritual of autographs, and finally, the return to a quiet, unremarkable hotel room. But inside those four walls, Houston felt the darkness tighten. He spoke of a presence he could not escape, a force that wasn't human, something ancient and predatory that had targeted his soul. He paced the floor until his feet were sore. He wept until he had no tears left. He begged for the whispers to stop. When the fear became unbearable, Houston made a desperate, primal attempt to escape. He tried to climb out of the hotel window, seeking a freedom that he believed only the fall could give him. His team caught him just in time, dragging him back from the ledge. Believing the worst had passed, they moved him to a room on the first floor for his own safety. They thought they had saved him. They didn't realize that the danger wasn't outside the window. It was already inside the room. It was inside him. Left alone for a few moments, Houston fell into a state that defied medical or psychological definition. In his mind, he was in the heat of a spiritual war, a battle for his very existence. He believed he had a mission, a sacrificial command to free himself from the devil he thought was clinging to his back. And in that moment of total blinding eclipse, he did the unthinkable. Using a simple plastic fork, Houston Summers gouged out his own left eye. When his bodyguard finally entered the room, the silence was unnatural. It was the kind of quiet that follows a massacre. He saw the blood on the floor. He saw Houston lying perfectly still, with a towel pressed firmly to his face. There was no screaming, no thrashing, only a terrifying, eerie calm. When the towel was lifted and the truth revealed itself, the world in that room shattered. Houston didn't offer a cry of pain. Instead, he whispered. He said he had to do it. He said it was the only way to stop the influence, the only way to win the battle he had been fighting since the spotlight first found him. He believed he had traded his sight for his soul. The London police arrived to find a young superstar whose life had just been permanently altered. He was taken to a psychiatric facility, but he wasn't just a patient, he was a casualty of a world that builds people up into gods, only to watch them tear themselves apart. When he finally returned to Los Angeles, the industry he had once dreamed of had no place for him. He walked away with a wound the world would talk about for years, but a weight that only he would ever truly feel. The boy who sang in the hallways was gone, and in his place was a survivor of a war that no one else could see. In the immediate wake of Houston's collapse, the world didn't just stop in its tracks. It began to dissect him with a clinical and often cruel fascination. The news of what had transpired in that London hotel room rippled across the globe with the force of a tidal wave. But as the grisly details emerged, empathy was frequently buried under a mountain of sensationalism. For a young star who had only recently been hailed as the future of R&B, his name was suddenly transformed into a grotesque headline, a cautionary tale that felt more like a gothic horror story than a human biography. In the United States, the story became a grim mirror reflecting the dark underbelly of the American dream. People who had followed his meteoric rise from the hallways of Hamilton High to the top of the Billboard charts now looked at the music industry with a newfound, sharp-edged suspicion. Mental health advocates and psychologists stepped into the spotlight, pointing toward the hidden, jagged cracks beneath the polished surface of celebrity culture. They spoke with urgency about the human cost of the corporate music machine, the relentless pace, the profound isolation, and the terrifying pressure that demands a 21-year-old act with the emotional fortitude of a veteran while being treated like a disposable, high-yield product. To the medical community, Houston was a living, breathing casualty, a reminder that the human mind can only be stretched so far across the rack of fame before it snaps in a way that modern medicine can barely hope to repair. But while the clinical world saw a psychological breakdown induced by exhaustion, the religious heart of America saw a different, much more ancient kind of tragedy. Houston had been raised on a foundation of deep, unshakable faith, in a world where the spiritual and the physical were never separate. When he spoke about spiritual warfare and the desperate need to get the devil off his back, many in the faith community did not dismiss his words as the ramblings of a broken mind. They took them at their chilling face value. They saw a young man of conviction who had entered an industry that often functions as a temple of secular excess and moral compromise. To them, Houston had encountered spiritual forces that his soul simply wasn't equipped to survive without losing a part of itself. His story echoed through churches' prayer circles and small-town pulpits as a profound martyrdom of the spirit, a man who felt he had been forced to choose between his physical sight and his eternal survival. In London, where the tragedy had actually unfolded, the reaction was sharper, colder, and far more intrusive. The British tabloids, notorious for their lack of boundaries, descended upon the story with a predatory glee. They focused almost exclusively on the visceral, shocking nature of the act, stripping away the humanity of the victim to sell papers and drive clicks. Across Europe, Houston was increasingly viewed through a lens of disbelief, a symbol of the dark side of American global fame, the way it can lift a child from obscurity and drop them into a void of madness before they've even had a chance to understand who they are. However, the most heartbreaking and perhaps most revealing reaction came from the industry itself. The very people who had shaped Houston, the executives who had signed his checks, the stylists who had chosen his skin-tight clothes, and the consultants who had scripted his interviews, suddenly became deafeningly silent. It was as if the machine didn't know how to process a tragedy that it couldn't spin into a marketing campaign. There were no tribute concerts, no fundraisers for his recovery, no public displays of corporate support. Instead, Houston Summers was quietly and efficiently erased from the priority lists. He was a liability, now a broken instrument that could no longer play the hit songs they demanded. When Houston finally returned to Los Angeles, the city that had once birthed his dreams felt like a landscape of ghosts. He was no longer the golden boy of Capitol Records. He was a walking ghost story, a man people looked at but rarely spoke to. He spent months in rehabilitation trying to stitch his mind back together in a world that wouldn't stop staring at the hollow space where his eye used to be. When he eventually spoke to the public, his voice lacked its former innocence, replaced by a heavy, somber wisdom. He spoke of the unseen forces in the industry that tried to force him to violate his core values, suggesting that the true danger hadn't come from the fame itself, but from the spiritual and moral erosion it required. He was a survivor. Yes, but he was a survivor who had realized that to save his life, he had to leave the world that had made him famous behind forever. He chose the quiet of the shadows over the violence of the light. In the years that followed the shattering events in London, the world moved on. New stars rose, new scandals broke, and the name Houston Summers began to drift from the active memory of the charts into the quiet archives of music history. But while his voice no longer echoed through the speakers of every radio station, Nathaniel Houston Summers was engaged in a much more significant project, the reconstruction of a human soul. He retreated into the deliberate stillness of Los Angeles, far from the blinding glare of the spotlights that had nearly burned him away. He was learning day by day how to inhabit a world that no longer expected him to be a god, but simply a man. Rebuilding a life after a collapse so public and so violent is not a linear journey. It is a labor of immense, fragile patience. Houston had to learn how to carry the physical and emotional scars of his past without letting them become his entire identity. He traded the frantic energy of tour buses and studio sessions for the grounding rhythms of faith and community. He didn't seek a comeback. He didn't chase the applause that had once felt like oxygen. Instead, he pursued something the industry could never manufacture, a sense of internal clarity. But Houston's story didn't end in quiet isolation. He eventually re-emerged not to reclaim his throne in the R&B world, but to serve as a witness for those who had been cast into the shadows. He channeled the intensity that once fueled his music into a courageous and unexpected mission, advocating for the human rights of the incarcerated. Specifically, he became a vocal leader in the fight against violence and sexual assault within the prison system. To the casual observer, the transition from a pop star to a prison reform advocate seemed jarring. But for Houston, it was the only logical path. He understood what it felt like to be trapped in a system that viewed human beings as commodities. He knew the terrifying reality of being overwhelmed by forces far larger and more predatory than himself. He recognized the cries of the silenced because he had once been one of them, shouting for help in a room where everyone else was too busy listening to the music to hear the man. His campaign for dignity behind bars was not an act of political theater. It was a profound act of recognition. It was his way of turning his own darkness into a lantern for others. In the eyes of the American public, the narrative around Houston began to shift. He was no longer just the shattered star or a tragic cautionary tale. A new kind of respect began to grow for him. A respect reserved for those who have the courage to walk away from a multi-million-dollar machine because it violated the core of their soul. He found a dignity in this work that no gold record could ever provide. He learned that the applause of a stadium is hollow compared to the quiet gratitude of a person who has finally been seen. Houston reclaimed his life not by pretending the tragedy never happened, but by using the wreckage of his former life to build a bridge for others. He proved that even when you lose a part of your sight, your vision for what is right can become clearer than ever before. He stepped out of the spotlight to find a truth that was far more enduring. And in doing so, he showed us that the most powerful thing an artist can do is not to entertain, but to survive and then to lead. History has a tendency to obsess over the stars, who burn out in a sudden spectacular blaze of glory, or those who stubbornly remain on stage long after their light has faded into a flicker. But there is a rare, quiet kind of heroism found in the man who realizes the house is on fire and has the courage to walk out the exit, even if he has to leave everything he worked for behind. Houston Summers' story does not end with a standing ovation, and it does not end with a triumphant comeback tour. It settles instead in a place of profound, hard-won peace, a place where survival itself becomes the ultimate form of victory. He did not return to reclaim the fame that once promised him the world, because he had discovered that the world the industry offered was a hollow one, built on shifting sands. What he pursued instead was something far more human and infinitely steadier clarity. He stopped chasing the fleeting applause of millions to find the quiet, unwavering approval of his own conscience. In the American landscape, his name remains a powerful living reminder that success is not a fortress, and fame is not armor. He taught us that the human mind can fracture even in the brightest, most expensive rooms. But more importantly, he showed us that those fractures can be stitched back together with faith time and an iron will to be free. People who hear his name today often focus solely on the tragedy of that winter night in London, but to focus only on the fall is to miss the staggering miracle of the rise that followed. The real story of Houston isn't about what he lost, the sight, the contracts, the stardom. It's about what he refused to give up He reclaimed his life by accepting the man he had become a witness to the darkness who chose every single day to live in the light of truth. He proved to a cynical world that dignity does not need a microphone, and purpose does not require a spotlight to be real. If Houston's journey reminds us of anything, as we look back, it is this: you do not have to rise in the way the world expects you to. You do not have to be the version of yourself that others have written in boardrooms and marketing meetings. You only have to stand in the way that keeps your soul intact. Houston Summers stepped out of the blinding light so he could finally see clearly. And in that clarity, he found a freedom that no hit record, no matter how many millions it sold, could ever provide. Some stories end without the closure of a happy ending, but they end with something much better: integrity. Houston is no longer running toward a flickering light. He is carrying his own. And for anyone standing alone in their own darkness, wondering if they can make it through the night, his life offers a quiet, steady truth. You can survive the breaking. You can walk away from the fire. And you can find your way home, even with one eye closed, as long as your heart is wide open.